Hello, everybody, and welcome to the next edition of our virtual talks here at Benjamin Franklin House. Today, I am very happy to introduce Paul Myles, and he'll be talking about Thomas Paine, who was a figure in the American Revolution, of course. And he is the author of two books about Thomas Paine. Thomas Paine in Lewes, 1768 to 1774, a prelude to American independence, and the rise of Thomas Paine and the case of Excise Officers. So without further ado, I will pass it on to Paul.
Hi, welcome, and thank you for attending. It's great to give this talk for the Benjamin Franklin House. I wrote the first edition of Thomas Paine in Lewes, 1768 to 1774, back in 2009, whereas I came up to the house and gave a talk on that, and came up to the Benjamin Franklin House last year and gave a talk on the second book, which was a result of questions left unanswered from the first book. Since then, unusually actually, I was asked to write, to mount an exhibition on Lewes railway station. The community trust people who serve Southern Rail wanted to celebrate a famous person who lived in Lewes, and they picked on Thomas Paine and came and asked me, which led me to, I'd sold out the first book, some 2,000 copies, and wanted to use all the images, and the best way of doing that was reprinting it, and in the reprinting of it, I've produced a second edition with some extra essays in which I'll talk about as we go through. So just to kick off then, this is Thomas Paine, painted in London in 1790. You can't see it up here. It says that. We don't know who the artist is. That's common for that time for the artist not to sign the portrait. This very rarely seen, this image actually. It's on the front of I use it as the front cover. I got permission. Found it in the National Portrait Gallery, Hines Gallery Archive, where it lies in Thomas Paine's box, and it's a photo of a painting. We don't know where the painting is, and as I said, we don't know who the artist is. But I particularly like this image because it shows a man in the flesh rather than a caricature. Most of the images of Thomas Paine are after Romney, and that painting is lost. There's an engraving afterwards, which is good, but then they descend into a kind of a caricature look of Paine. So, but I like this one. It shows a real man in the prime of his life. So why Lewes? Here's, let me just get this working. There we are. Why Lewes? This is Lewes in 1760, actually, some 8 years before Thomas Paine rode into town. This was painted by Dominique Serres, who ended up marine painter to King George III, but this was earlier in his life, where he came to Lewes twice. There's a painting that he executed in 1768 as well. This is the better painting. It's a big painting. It's nearly 2 meters wide and 1 meter high. It's a huge canvas, and this is in private ownership, but they very kindly have let us use this, and I really like this painting. It shows Lewes from the south. You can see the Norman Castle. Just to the left of the Norman Castle, you can see the spire of St Michael's Church, where Thomas Paine got married. Pelham House is bathed in sunlight here. The Duke of Newcastle's one of the Duke of Newcastle's residents, the Prime Minister who died the year that Thomas Paine rode into town into a hotly contested election. So this is Lewes now that you can see here. It's not much change from today actually, and it's the town which Thomas Paine would have known very well indeed, and the surrounds, as he was an outrider of excise. So we're not quite sure where he rode. We think probably to the north of Lewes, but there it is, bathed in sunlight, a beautiful painting. So it's nice to see. And why Lewes for me? I'm born and bred in Lewes, and having apprenticed here as a structural engineer, and run several businesses in Lewes and in New Haven, a nearby town, in engineering, having built a significant percentage of factories and showgrounds and boats and piers around here. We had 3 factories there. I turned to psychology later and arts business. We did 4 major exhibitions in town, including Rodin, Henry Morse, Anthony Caro, and David Nash. And then I was asked to run an exhibition in 2009 on the life of Thomas Paine. And I've been on that subject ever since. It's endlessly fascinating, the 18th century, very lively period. And there was an unanswered questions. So here's the 2nd edition of the book, Thomas Paine in Lewes. You can see here 2nd edition, and it was very good to get back to this actually, because we found out quite a lot of general knowledge, as well as the more specific knowledge about the case of the officers of excise. And you'll see at the bottom here, Colin Brent is a contributor to this book. Deborah Gage, who's General Thomas Gage, was the Commander-in-Chief of the British forces just as the War of Independence started in America. And Deborah, who was an ancestor to Deborah Gage, and she is the family historian and curator of the Gage family home at Firle Place. And she very generously wrote an essay in the 1st edition of this, but has added 2 more since, and they're really interesting. I'll get to them as we go along in a minute. So there we are, the 2nd edition. I was able to add an essay as well about the separation document. Thomas Paine separated, it turns out, from Elizabeth. He married Elizabeth Olive in Lewes, his 2nd wife. His first wife died in childbirth, Mary Lambert, but he married Elizabeth Olive. He moved in with the High Constable in Bull House in Lewes. He didn't move into the White Hart. And after Samuel Olive died, Thomas Paine moved out, and he married Elizabeth, the daughter, and moved back in. Now, without going too much into the first damning biographies of Paine by a writer who was employed to condemn him, who claimed that there were all sorts of shenanigans and that they divorced and Paine was bankrupt. None of this is true. And we know it because we found, as we did the exhibition, someone came forward with the separation document, the actual document that lays out the agreement. It's particularly interesting because Elizabeth invoked a bit of canon law at that time, which was claiming that the marriage wasn't consummated, and the reasons why it wasn't. And Paine had to undergo examination, as did she, and it was found out that he had capability. And the details of that are quite interesting. I lay out in the essay. It's a very different idea of sexual relationships at that time. Views of women and men, very different. Women seen more as the sexual predator then. A lot of good history on that I found in the Wellcome Institute in London, and it's fascinating and hard to leave alone once you start, actually. Anyway, this is the bones of the story here, and this is the actual document. Whereas you can see Thomas Paine's signature and Elizabeth Paine and the solicitor's signature. Whereas you can see at the bottom here that Elizabeth gave Thomas Paine £45 in settlement. Now, it's interesting for a few reasons. One is that Elizabeth had inherited in equal share her father's estate, which included Bull House and some land, some copyhold land and pertinences and belongings. And in that time, once a woman had married a man, everything was his. He didn't have to give her anything, actually. If she could have afforded a divorce, a very expensive thing, a very rare thing to do. There was only 2 a year at that time. Elizabeth invoked the canon law. They were duly inspected. He had capability, so they separated. And it's quite a long document. I have transcribed it. That's online somewhere. But that they both agreed not to harass each other. She was to live as a sole femme for the rest of her life. and he very quietly gave her money for the rest of his life. And Elizabeth, even though she lived in a country that was aflamed with hatred of Paine, especially after Rights of Man and the French Revolution, she would never hear a word said against him and would quietly withdraw from the room. Deborah Gage, this is the first essay in the first book about, Deborah wrote about her ancestor, General Gage, on the eve of revolution, and it's another good story, whereas a lot of misconceptions were overturned. And there's some lovely detail here, especially on the fact that the people in New York loved General Gage and awarded him the freedom of the city and a golden casket and a pension, which he received the rest of his life. The editions, and here he is. The editions, new to the second edition, is the Montresor map of New York, fascinating. Early days for mapping this, and this map was produced to assist Thomas Gage, who could see trouble coming. And this is the map. So it's a very early, rare map of New York, and this hangs in the Infirl place. This house has been in the ownership of the Gage family for 700 years, so has a bit of history on it. And also, Deborah wrote about the document chest, which is also in the house. You can go and look at it. It's fascinating. Which it says here they contained, there were several document chests actually, and together they contain more than 21,000 manuscripts, which are now in the Clements Library in Ann Arbor, Michigan. So a lot of detail there to come out further. I know Deborah's working on that, and I know she's watching today. So hello, Deborah. Nice to hope you're enjoying this. This is the chest. I went out and photographed it. So there we are with the little labels on it. It's fascinating to see something that hasn't really been touched at all since that time. So on to the case of the Officers of Excise. So this is moving on to the more detailed work here, which was an unanswered question. We wrote that book after the festival. It was a successful festival, by the way. There were some 6,000 events. We had over 10 days, some of the repeats, obviously, but it was a very lively affair. Lots of people got involved. But there was a question that was left unanswered, certainly in my mind. We'd found out quite a bit about that wasn't known before, which was in that first book. But what kept bothering me was, how could anyone rise from being an officer of excise, a fairly lowly position? Paine didn't come from money, didn't have a brilliant education. He certainly didn't come from wealth and status, but not long after he left Lewes in 1774, he wrote Common Sense, which is a document which puts him in the pantheon of world literature. And he's considered one of the founding fathers of the United States of America. In fact, he coins that phrase in the third crisis paper. I think it comes out for the first time, where he talks about the United States of America, where he's encouraging people to break free of the shackles of hereditary succession in this country. So, how could this happen? And I mentioned earlier on George Chalmers, who wrote under the name of Francis Oldys, was employed by the Pitt government after Paine wrote Rights of Man later. Just mentioned Paine's writing now, that he wrote Common Sense in the first place. Later he wrote Rights of Man Part 1 and Part 2. Part 1 laying out, arguing with Burke about the French Revolution and how we should throw off the shackles of hereditary monarchy, and Part 2 really laying out a welfare state which is all familiar to us all now, especially in the UK. But he lays out how to have a welfare state, and the Pitt government were scared stiff at the time of a revolution happening here. There were quite a lot of people for it. Price and other great thinkers were advocating for us to go through what they've been through in France at that time. Paine was called to France actually to sit on the assembly, the first assembly of the Republic of France. So they were very frightened about that. So that's why they employed Aldous, George Chalmers, who was an assiduous researcher, quite a good writer actually, ended up on the board of trade, quite an important chap. And they paid him £500 to write that first biography, which doesn't miss a trick to defame and slander. Well, not exactly slander, but defame Paine. So, but even he praised the case of the Officers of Excise, which Paine wrote while he was in Lewes. And Paine wrote this treatise, this 21 octavo pamphlet, 21-page octavo pamphlet, in support of his fellow officers for better paying conditions. And it's even Chalmers said that it was well written. So for him to say something good about Paine is extraordinary. Now, so there were two questions here: how did anyone ordinary get to be a writer of world importance in such a short time? And how do you accelerate? How do you bootstrap up into the kind of world that people like Benjamin Franklin inhabited? You know, a superstar at the time. And meet people like George Lewis Scott, who was a previously preceptor tutor to King George III and a commissioner of excise. How on earth could this happen? And that's what really bothered me. And we'll just trot through that journey now of discovery, if we like. So the case of the officers that he wrote is a detailed account of a very large organisation beset by corruption from within and above. So the whole country was. This is a very large, well-organised organisation. The Excise Service was a civil service. They were in the employ of the king, not the government. And what he does when he lays open the problems, which is a kind of a huge whistleblowing in a way, a whistleblowing that was instructed from above. This is the extraordinary thing. So there had been whistleblowing, but the convention at that time was to sack whoever whistleblower got the sack, or the last one in got the sack. There was a convention of not dealing with it properly. He shows his philosophical values, his core human values, and he gets to straight to the core values of human decency, which resounds through his later work, which after Rights of Man, there's the Age of Reason, Agrarian Justice. It resounds through his whole writing career. So here we are. Here's the front page of the case of the Officers of Excise. It's a very rare document. I found this copy down with a load of others in the British Library, and the American Philosophical Society bought a case. There were 3,800 copies of these printed in Lewes at the time by William Lee, the printer of the local newspaper, and they were distributed to every officer, both Houses of Parliament, and to important businessmen right across the UK. So it's a big effort, this, and they're very, very rare things, very expensive if you could find one, I think. This is the front page where he gets straight to the point. So the numerous evils arising to the revenue from the insufficiency of the present salary. Their pay had been frozen by statute for 100 years, and this had been a period of inflation, and the excise officers were really struggling. Paine lays this out in the case, and it shows that after they've paid for their horse and their accommodation, they're moved around the country like police officers are now, or army people are. So they couldn't be with their families. They had to subsist themselves, pay for their own horse. And they were earning, once all that was deducted from the roughly £50 a year they were paid as a salary, they were left with less than a labourer. So they were struggling, and this was causing corruption. The whole system was corrupt. They had to be. So The first clue was a letter to the great Oliver Goldsmith, who wrote She Stoops to Conquer, a play that's never been off the stage ever since it was written in 1774 or 4, I think he brought that out. It was on the London stage. It's never been off the stage since. The great Goldsmith, who writes The Deserted Village, the connected Goldsmith, who's friends with Johnson, Garrick, Reynolds, Burke, all the great thinkers, all the great people. They met in the Turk's Head in London. He was very well known indeed. Paine wrote to him in 1772 after he'd written the case, introducing himself. And here's his signature, which is rather a nice thing to see. He didn't take up with him afterwards. Actually, they never met again. A lot of biographies say they did. There's no evidence to that effect. They couldn't have done. Johnson died soon. Goldsmith died soon after this. But this is the first clue. He wrote that Paine was a principal promoter for a plan for applying to Parliament this session for an increase of salary. A petition for this purpose has been circulated through every part of the kingdom and signed by the officers therein. So there we are. And it said here, he should not have undertaken it had I not been particularly applied to by some of my superiors in office. Now, High March Chalmers more or less said that Paine was a rabble-rouser, a troublemaker. He roused his fellow officers into causing all this trouble again, and so on and so forth. And those words have resounded down through many biographies since. Most biographers of Paine miss this point. They don't look at the case of the officers of Excise anyway. When they do, they echo Chalmers and get it wrong. But here are the clues. He says that he was applied to by superiors in office. So that was the first clue we had to work. So how could this happen? How could Paine get picked up like this from being an outrider, a lowly worker? And he says it's been circulated, a petition here, this is a key word, a petition for this purpose has been circulated through every part of the kingdom and signed by all the officers therein. Now, first of all, the case isn't a petition. The case supports the petition. Okay, so it's a two-strand effort, this. So, and up until this research, we couldn't find any of the signatures. Not one. We couldn't find any signatures. We had the case, but we didn't have the signatures. We didn't know what they looked like. We didn't know what the petition looked like. And it really dogged this inquiry, the fact that for years, I mean, I'd looked, everybody else had looked and couldn't find them. So this is the part of the organisation. And so it's clear that this came from above. This is a letter to the commissioners of excise. And you can see Thomas Paine as part of a committee of 8. Now, these 8 other officers were scattered all over the nation. They never got together. It wouldn't be possible to organise something like this then. It'd be very difficult now, actually, to do what they did, to print 3,000 copies and to organise something nationally without having a union. No, they didn't have a trade union here. This does, in fact, represent the first national trade union ever in the world of workers for better pay and conditions. So it's quite a big thing in itself, but the trade union didn't exist then. So this had to have been organised from above with the convention of a committee to make it look more important, to make it look more organised. And this is the letter to the commissioners of excise, one of which is George Lewes Scott, who, as we shall find out, is our man. This is the letter from the commissioners of excise to the Lords of the Treasury. And here we see George Lewes Scott, here, his signature. And later, Paine wrote to his friend Henry Lorenz, and says that it was that amiable old gent, George Lewes Scott, who introduced me to Benjamin Franklin. And it's through George Lewes Scott that we found the traditions of the royal family through his close contacts. So there's our man, George Lewes Scott, who was brought on as a commissioner to the excise, as a known great mathematician and an original thinker. And it looks to me, you'll see as we carry on, that he was brought in to unravel the corruption in the excise service. This was the answer. So let me just jumped there. This was the answer. So you can see that the Commissioners of Excise wrote to the Lords of the Treasury on the February the 5th. On February the 9th, they got the answer, nil. They get nothing. There's no pay rise. They're not getting anything. And I write in the book, you can see the details in this one. Lord North was in charge at the time. They were getting requests from everywhere because everyone was suffering with this inflation. And just before this had gone in, the officers of the Navy had requested similar requests for higher pay. And North said in the House of Commons that if we give it to them, we'll have to give it to them all. So they were frozen. They didn't know what to do, quite frankly. So they said no to everybody. So we just back to this. Where were these signatures of the petition, and how did this bit come about? And so we went. I was taking students up to Kew at that time. I was under the wing of Professor Watmore at the University of Sussex, doing a DPhil, and I used to take students up and teach them how to look through the treasury boxes. So deep in the bowels of the National Archives, in the treasury boxes, which are uncatalogued documents, we came across the signatures. Here we are, we found them. We found enough to put this story together. So here they are. It's on a big fold-out piece of paper. You can see the petition up the top here, and here are all the signatures of the officers, where they are, and roughly what they do. And from these, we found two of these from the there were 51 collections of excise in the nation. Large areas. One was Wales, and one was Hertfordshire. You'd have a collection of Sussex, you had a collection of Cornwall, where you would have a collector who would be in charge of that collection, that area, and then you'd have supervisors under him in county towns like Lewes. So when someone whistle blew in the past, the supervisor never got the sack. The collector certainly didn't. He was way too important for that. So they generally picked on the last in. And this happened to Thomas Paine himself in Afford. It turns out that he blew the whistle on Swallow, his corrupt supervisor. And Paine himself was removed. His supervisor, Swallow, was himself removed some months later for using Paine's orderly books. So this is just, Paine was taken back into the service quite quickly, expediently. He refused a post in Grandpound, which was particularly known for corruption. Cornwall was particularly bad, and as we shall find out later. And so this was a movement. This was something gathering pace in the nation, and Paine was a big part of the story. Now it turns out. Now we can piece the story together. This is the petition that was on the top. So what happened with this petition was several bits of paper that would have moved round a collection, would have moved around from town to town. With this piece of writing up the top here is in very short, clumsy words in comparison to Paine's writing, but it says more or less the same thing. So the pay's been frozen. They have to be corrupt in order to live, in order to feed their families. Everybody's having to be corrupt because they're stuck. And if they blow the whistle, they get the sack and it's impossible to sort this out. So the very act of these signatures themselves are very, 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 very revealing. I can only say so much. This is one of the main clues. I can only say so much in 30 minutes. So this is one of the clues that gave it away. This is the front of this piece of paper that's all folded up with the signatures and the petition. This is the front of it. And so it says, officers of the Revenue of Excise in Scotland crossed out Wales, memorial for additional pay. So memorial, petition, these words are interchangeable at that time. The fact that Scotland's crossed out and Wales is written in means that this must have come from Central. They wouldn't make that mistake if they were creating this document in Wales. It had to come out of Central Office. So that's one of the big clues that placed this in London, in Broad Street, in the Excise Office where George Lewes Scott sat, and Paine was called up to help him write the case. So there's another strand here with the minute books of the Excise, which in very short form, it's a wonderful resource, this. They went in monthly to the Excise Office. These are the minute books that were kept all over the country that went in, that talked about the characters of the Excise Officers, if they were misdemeanoring, and a lot of them were, and what they did with them, people being removed, dismissed, taken back on, caught with corruption, very rarely sacked, only the young ones. But we came across exactly at this time, normally didn't dwell too long on or anything, we found 20 pages about the corruption in the excise from Cornwall exactly this time. And it was amazing. And this time they did sack the collector and they did move the supervisors. So this was part of this general movement, and £1 in Cornwall, Paine had refused posting that and came to Lewes instead. And this is what a minute book looks like, and this is in beautiful flowing text, and this is the beginning of the Cornwall 20-page entry, of which it goes through every trick in the book, as it were, exposed. So there was another strand that helped us pull together, which I just touch on future research now, but William Lee, who printed the case of the Officers of Excise for George Lewes Scott and Thomas Paine in Lewes, was also started the first ever Sussex newspaper, the Sussex Weekly Advertiser Royal Lewes Journal in 1746. I was able to digitise the years that Paine was in town, because I'm very tiring looking at them at the microfilm. Eventually the library allowed me to get them scanned into PDFs. You can't do text recognition, it's too dirty and smudgy. So I've been working on this for several years now, and have eventually, I've classified them into years, months, weeks, pages, and I'm going through every article and putting it in a Word document so that we can start to get our eye on what's going on. It's an amazing resource. This is what it looks like as I do it. I colour code the articles. Anything blue like that is juniors, anything red is Wilkes, orange is of interest. And then I put that into a Word document like this. Just as an example, if I go back one, this article here is Junius. Now, Junius, to this day, we don't know who he is. He's the deep throat at the time. He was publishing in the Public Advertiser in London, but provincial newspapers who took most of their information from the London newspapers were also printing them, but they would have been risking their neck to do this. The Public Advertiser was prosecuted. They never found who Junius was. So Lee was taking a risk here. It's what really got my interest. And then all this lively news railing against the king and what was generally perceived as a corrupt minister at the time. Another example on page 2 is a story about the monk and the Jew. It's a tale. there's some interest in this because we can track some of Paine's writing. He became editor of the Pennsylvania magazine in Philadelphia just after he got to America in 1774. And this is from that, and you can see here that the Tale of the Monk and the Jew appears again. There's the pseudonym Atlanticus there. We know Paine wrote under the pseudonym of Atlanticus when he wrote 2 or 3 letters that were published in the Sussex Weekly Advertisable Journal. This is a work in progress. It's a long, deep work which will produce many lively findings, I'm sure. So there we are. The case of the Officers of Excise is a new story. It was a long, slow national campaign to sort out the country. Benjamin Franklin, I didn't know this until this research, I say it in the book, was openly, at the same time, was openly attacking the bungling ministry through the public advertiser, the same paper as Junius was writing at the time. So Franklin wasn't keeping his head down at this time. Don't forget, he was working for the king at that time, Postmaster General for the North American colonies. So he was taking a rest. It hadn't happened yet. The War of Independence hadn't started yet. So there we are. That's this book, which is on sale. I'm allowed to have a plug on here, but all proceeds go to the Thomas Paine Society to continue this research and so on and so forth. It's available online all over the world on print on demand or download for ebooks. We kept the price low for students. There's a couple of testimonials there, one from Professor Watmore, one from Melvin Bragg, who thought it was worth writing about. This is the second edition of this book, which this time is now available. It wasn't before, but it's available all over the world, print on demand, and also a download on Kobo only until I've got to do some more work to get it on Amazon, but it's on Kobo. You can find it anywhere, and it's a cheap download for about, I don't know, £5 or £6, and that's the back of that book. So there we are. That's the conclusion of this little talk. Hope you've enjoyed it, and I'll finish, and if anyone has any questions, I'll be delighted.
Thank you very much, Paul, for that talk and interesting work that you're doing on Thomas Paine. So we do have time for questions now. And so there's 2 ways that you can ask questions. You can either write a question in the Q&A that you can see the button at the bottom of your screen, or if you would like to ask Paul your question in person, you can raise your hand and I will call on you. So we already have a question in the Q&A which says, is there any evidence that Paine and Franklin were working together to foment revolution, either after Franklin left Craven Street or perhaps before?
I think evidence. Sorry, could you just ask that question again, please?
Is there any evidence that Paine and Franklin were working together, either after Franklin left Craven Street or perhaps before?
Yes, that's a good question. That is a very good question. My suspicion is that Paine was recognised as a craftsman writer. His writing of the case of the Officers is eloquent, clear, cogent, even a little bit witty, and it's clear that he was chosen because he could write. Much as Samuel Johnson was a craftsman writer, this was the status of a writer at that time. It was considered a craft more than anything else, and Paine could do it. So yes, I think evidence. No, that's another matter. The evidence, if it lies anywhere, the evidence can be drawn from this. Okay. From the fact that Scott, we know Scott introduced Paine to Benjamin Franklin. We know that Franklin wrote him a letter of introduction to the United States of America, and they wrote to each other ever since. Would you show what you were plotting in writing? No, I don't think you put that down in pen and paper. But if you look back and do it on the law of probability, I think yes, I think they were. Yeah, I do think they were. As for the evidence, you have to draw it from probability. no hard evidence, or this is as hard as it gets.
So the next question that we have is, what was the connection between General Gage and Paine, other than the fact that they both lived in Lewes?
None. They were in totally different spheres, completely different. When I mentioned that they were both in Lewes at the same time, I think that did happen because General Gage, I'm pretty sure, visited his brother at Firle Place in the years that Paine was here. So it's quite possible they might have walked the same street together, but I don't think they would have had no contact. They were so far apart in social status, it was highly unlikely. They would have, Paine knew about Gage because his letters, America was being reported, and this is one of the exciting things about this research. Gage is cited many times on the front pages of the Sussex Weekly Advertiser or Lewes Journal. People in Lewes were well apprised of what was going on in America. It was front page news in Lewes in detail. So Paine certainly would have known about General Gage, but at that time General Gage was in America, and he was right. Paine was reading detailed reports of what troops were up to in New York at that time. Before the first shot was heard around the world, there was trouble there, some trouble. Yeah. But they wouldn't have known each other.
Next question we have is, I believe that Thomas fought as a Continental Army soldier. When and where did he enlist, if you know, and did he meet with General Washington?
You would have to refer to other scholars for that. I tend to look at just this slice, and I do intend to move on to that. I'm talking to the American Philosophical Society about that. It's almost without doubt he met Washington. When he enlisted, again, I think that's fairly well documented. You could find that out, I think. I can't answer that question. But early on, I mean, he wrote the 13 Crisis Papers, and they were distributed, more popular than the Bible at the time. They were very widely read. He was well known, so he was known to all the founding fathers. So sorry, don't know, but probably easy to find out. Fairly easy to find that out. In fact, I'd be interested. Let me know when you find out.
So in the separation document that you showed, Elizabeth and Thomas both signed their name Pain. When did the E arrive?
There's a letter from Thomas. There's two letters that Paine wrote on the same day from Lewes. One to his neighbour, and one to someone else. I can't remember who it is. But one he signs it Pain, and on the other he spells it with an E. These were common interchangeable spellings of names in those days. So he uses it almost exclusively with an E after it is, with an E after he gets to America, but before without. It's a minor thing, I think, that it was common then to mess around with spellings.
So the next question we have is, where did the Headstrong Club and the Society of Honest Whigs gather to discuss matters?
Right, okay. It was the White Hart Evening Club, right? That's what it was called. It was the Headstrong Book of Obstinacy that, according to Lee the Younger, and we think this Book of Obstinacy existed, was nothing but an old book of Homer that was presented to the most obstinate haranguer. Paine was given this on more than one occasion. They met in the sheriff's room of the White Hart, which is still there exactly the same. It's amazing. And we've had debates in there, and we've broadcast from there and had a lot of fun in there. They're still out there on the web somewhere, these debates and what have you that we've had in there since. But that was already going when Paine got to town, I think. And so that's where they met. They met upstairs in the sheriff's room, an oak-panelled room in the White Hart Hotel. Pardon me.
So we have time for one more question, and I think this brings it all together with Benjamin Franklin House. So maybe you can answer this. Is there any evidence that Paine ever visited Craven Street while Franklin was in residence there, from the research that you've done?
Well, he visited London. No, I can't find. I've trawled for this. I've really looked for this. I would love to find this. We know that George Lewis Scott visited there. We know that. There's evidence to show that, but none at all of Paine meeting Franklin. Well, he was introduced to him. He says that himself. George Lewis Scott did that. Where he was introduced to him, I don't know. So it could have been anywhere. It's possible, actually. A tantalising thought.
Well, thank you very much, Paul, for taking the time to speak about your 2 books today and the research that you're doing. We're very grateful that you're willing to be part of this virtual lecture series that we're doing now. As Paul has mentioned, both his books are available for purchase. The links will be available on our website if you'd like to purchase them. As well as we do make all of these lectures available for free. So we do appreciate any kind of donations to help us keep our programming free. So every little bit counts. So we would appreciate any kind of donations. But otherwise, this recording will be available on our website and online and on YouTube. So if you didn't manage to catch all of it, we hope to see you online. So thank you very much, Paul.
Okay, it's a pleasure. Thank you. Bye-bye.